The room had gone quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when 20 important people have already decided how something is going to end. Hartwell Hall, on a gray Saturday morning in late March, smelled of floor wax and cold coffee. On the stage sat a black Steinway concert grand that cost more than the house Eli Carter had grown up in. And walking toward it, in a button-down shirt 2 sizes too big and dress shoes that had belonged to another boy before him, was an 11-year-old who had taken 2 buses and walked 9 blocks to be there. His sheet music was held together with clear packing tape. When he set it on the piano's music desk, the tape caught the stage light and glinted, and somewhere in the third row, a judge named Gregory Tate let out a small, unmistakable laugh. It traveled. A polite ripple of it moved across the panel and into the first few rows of waiting families. Eli heard it. Everyone watching him heard it. He sat down on the bench, adjusted it the way his teacher had taught him, lifted his small hands, and held them over the keys while the laughter died into something worse than laughter. Patience, the kind people offer when they are waiting for a thing to be over. Then his right hand came down on a single note, and 10 seconds later, not one person in Hartwell Hall was laughing. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from today. Drop your city and the time on your clock into the comments. There's something about knowing a story like this one is being heard in a dozen places at once that never stops moving me. To understand what happened in those 10 seconds, you have to go back to a narrow brick house on Wexley Street in the Fairview section of Marlow, Ohio, where Eli Carter lived with his grandmother in 4 rooms that always smelled like cinnamon and clean. Laundry. Eli was 11 years old that spring, small for his age, with serious eyes and a habit of going quiet for long stretches that strangers sometimes mistook for shyness. It wasn't shyness, it was listening. Eli heard things other people walked right past: the rhythm of the dryer, thumping a towel against the drum, the particular pitch of the kettle when it was 30 seconds from the boil, the way the number 14 bus changed its engine note as it slowed at the corner of Wexley and Pruitt. He had been collecting sounds since before he could explain why. He was raised by Della Carter, 63, who had worked 26 years in the laundry and linens department of Marlow General Hospital, and now kept other people's children during the day to make ends meet. Della was a big lawing, scripture-quoting, no-nonsense woman who could stretch a chicken across 4 dinners and who had never in her life let a child sit at her table feeling small. Eli's mother, Renata, was 29 and worked the overnight shift as a certified nursing assistant at a long-term care facility called Cedar Pines, which meant she slept while Eli was at school and was gone when he went to bed. The 3 of them passed the days like relay runners handing off a baton, and the baton was Eli. His father had left when Eli was 3. Della never spoke badly of the man, which was its own kind of mercy. And Eli had stopped asking about him around the time he learned that some questions only make a room go quiet. The piano came into Eli's life by accident, the way most important things do. When he was 7, Della started bringing him along to the New Hope Community Center on Garner Avenue, where she volunteered on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons sorting donated clothes. In a back room that used to be a Sunday school classroom, there was an old upright piano, a brown Baldwin with a cracked soundboard and 4 keys that didn't play and a middle C that stuck if you pressed it too hard. Nobody used it. Eli found it the first week, climbed onto the wobbly bench, and didn't get off until Della came looking for him 2 hours later. He couldn't read a note. He didn't know what he was doing, but he had heard a hymn that morning at the front desk, where someone kept a radio low, and he sat at that broken Baldwin and found the melody 1 finger at a time, hunting for it across the yellowed keys, missing, correcting, until it was right. Della stood in the doorway and watched her grandson teach himself a song by ear on a piano that nobody had loved in years, and she did not say a word, because she understood, in the way that grandmothers understand, that she was looking at something she would remember for the rest of her life. The man who changed everything was named Walter Briggs. Walter was 74, a retired music teacher who had spent 31 years in the Marlow public schools before the budget cuts of the early 2000s folded the music program into a single overworked position and squeezed him toward early retirement. He came to New Hope on Thursdays to play cards with the other men in the front room, and on the Thursday he first heard a child picking out a Chopin nocturne, on that wrecked Baldwin, by a 7-year-old who didn't know what Chopin was. He set down his cards, walked back to the old Sunday school room, and stood listening with his hand over his mouth. "Who taught you that, son?" he asked, when Eli finally stopped. "The radio," Eli said. Walter Briggs sat down on the bench beside him, and from that day until almost the end, he never really got up again. He taught Eli for free. He brought his own metronome, his own sheet music, his own patience. He taught the boy to read notation, then taught him that reading was only the floor and not the ceiling. He drilled scales until Eli's hands ached, and then told him stories about the great pianists to make the aching worth it. When the city threatened to haul the Baldwin away as junk, Walter paid a tuner $40 out of his pension to make it as right as a dying piano could be made, and he taped a hand-lettered sign to the top that read, "Do not remove, student in progress." Della laughed when she saw it. Walter did not. He meant it. "This boy," he told Della one evening, walking her and Eli to the bus stop, "I have taught a lot of children, hundreds. I have taught maybe 4 who had it. He has it, you understand me? He has the thing you cannot put into a child. All you can do is not crush it." Walter Briggs taught Eli Carter for almost 4 years. And then, in January of the year Eli turned 11, 2 weeks after Christmas, Walter's heart gave out in his sleep, and a piano student in progress lost the only person who had ever told him that the thing he heard in the world was worth something. Eli didn't cry at the service. He sat between his grandmother and his mother in a borrowed jacket and stared at the program in his hands. But that night he went to the community center after hours. Della had a key from her volunteering, and he sat at the broken Baldwin in the dark and played until his mother came to find him at 11 o'clock. He had written something, a new thing, slow and simple, built around that stubborn sticking middle C, a melody that climbed and fell and circled back the way grief circles, back when you think you've set it, down. He didn't have a name for it yet. He played it for his mother in the empty building, and Renata, who had not slept properly in years, and who carried more than any 29-year-old should have to, put her face in her hands and wept, and Eli kept playing, because he didn't know what else to do with what he was feeling except put it into the keys. That was who Eli Carter was on the morning he walked into Hartwell Hall. Now that you've spent a little time with Eli, with Della, with his mother working those long nights, with Mr. Briggs and that taped-up old piano, I have to ask you, does this boy remind you of someone? A kid you knew who carried a gift nobody around them could afford to nurture? Tell me about them down in the comments. I read everyone. The reason Eli was at Hartwell Hall that Saturday had a name, and the name was the Sterling Scholarship. The Brennan Conservatory of Music sat on a hill on the east side of Marlow, all limestone and ivy and tall windows, the kind of place Eli had passed on the bus 100 times without ever imagining he might walk through its doors. Once a year, the conservatory's preparatory division held open auditions for the Sterling Scholarship, a single full-ride award, tuition and instrument and instruction completely covered, given to one young musician between the ages of 10 and 14 from the Greater Marlow region. For a family like the Carters, it was not one opportunity among many. It was the only door, and it opened once. The scholarship had been endowed 18 years earlier by a man named Howard Sterkerling, a steel fortune heir and amateur cellist, who had died believing that talent was distributed evenly across the world and opportunity was not, and who had wanted, with his money, to close a little of that gap. Whether his vision had survived him was another question. The scholarship was now administered by his widow, Eleanor Sterling, 71, who chaired the audition panel every year and who had, over 18 years of watching polished, expensively trained children file across that stage, come to believe, without ever quite admitting it to herself, that the gap Howard wanted to close mostly closed itself in favor of the children who already had everything. Eleanor Sterling was not a cruel woman. This matters. She was a woman who had once played beautifully herself and given it up for a marriage, who had spent 18 years surrounded by prodigies and had grown tired in a way that looked, from the outside, like coldness. She had heard 10,000 auditions. She had learned to know, she believed, within a few bars, whether a child had been properly prepared, and she had developed the gatekeeper's worst habit, which is to mistake preparation for talent and polish for promise. The other two judges that day were Gregory Tate, 58, the conservatory's senior piano faculty, a man of real accomplishment and real vanity, who wore his reputation the way other men wear cologne, and Marcus Reyes, 34, the newest member of the faculty, a former scholarship student himself, who still remembered what it felt like to walk into a room like this one's with the wrong shoes. Eli's audition slot was 11:40 in the morning. He and Della left Wexley Street at 9:15 to be safe. The 14 bus to the transfer point, the wait in the cold, the 6 bus up the east side hill, the 9-block walk because the closest stop had been moved for construction. Renata had wanted to come but had worked until 7 a.m. and could barely stand. Eli had kissed her cheek and told her to sleep and promised to tell her everything. He carried his taped sheet music in a plastic grocery bag to keep it dry. Della wore her church coat. They arrived at 11:05 and immediately understood, in the way that people who have less always immediately understand, that they did not belong. The lobby of Hartwell Hall was full of families in a different income bracket. There were boys in pressed blazers and girls in dresses with their hair done, carrying instruments in cases worth thousands of dollars, accompanied by private teachers murmuring last reminders. There was a mother quizzing her son on his program. There was a coffee station with little glass bottles of sparkling water that nobody had told Eli were free. Della found the registration table and gave Eli's name to a young woman with a clipboard, and there it was, the first small wound of the day. A flicker across the woman's face, a quick involuntary recalculation, before the professional smile snapped back into place. Carter, Eli. 11:40, the woman said. And his teacher is. His teacher passed in January, Della said. He prepared on his own since then. The pause was very short, but Eli caught it. He caught everything. They waited on a bench in the hall. Eli watched the other children go in and come out. Through the doors, when they opened, he could hear pieces he recognized. A Mozart sonata, a Bach invention, a Schumann he and Walter had worked through the year before. Polished, clean, correct. Eli's hands had gone cold. He flexed them inside his sleeves and did the breathing Walter had taught him. 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out, and tried not to look at the taped music in his lap. At 11:38 a staff member opened the door and said his name, and Eli stood, and Della took his face in her 2 hands, the way she had every morning of his life, and said, very quietly, "Mr. Briggs is in that room with you. Don't you forget it." And Eli walked in alone. The audition room was the main hall, the panel seated at a long table in the 3rd row of the empty house, the stage and the great black Steinway lit and waiting. Eli walked up the side steps. His borrowed shoes were loud on the wood. He set his plastic bag down, took out his taped sheet music, and arranged it on the music desk. And it was then that Gregory Tate, glancing at the packing tape catching the light, leaned to Eleanor Sterling and said something low and laughed. Eleanor Sterling looked up over her reading glasses at the small boy on her stage. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying in the empty hall with the flat efficiency of someone running behind schedule, "what will you be playing for us this morning?" "An original composition," Eli said. "I wrote it myself." There was a beat, and then Gregory Tate laughed again, openly this time, and shook his head, and Eleanor Sterling's mouth tightened into something that was not quite a smile. "I see," she said. "You understand, I hope, that this is a classical preparatory audition. We do generally expect a prepared work from the standard repertoire. Did no one explain the requirements?" "My teacher told me to play the truest thing I had," Eli said. A few of the staff lingering at the back of the hall tittered. Marcus Reyes did not laugh. He was watching the boy's hands. But Eli heard the laughter that did come, heard it bounce off the high ceiling of that beautiful room, and for one terrible second the whole thing, the two buses, the cold, the borrowed shoes, the taped music, the empty space where Walter Briggs should have been sitting, all of it pressed down on his small shoulders at once, and his eyes stung, and he came within a single breath of picking up his plastic bag and walking out the way he'd come. Picture it for a second. 11 years old. He's lost the one teacher who ever believed in him. He's traveled across the city on 2 buses to a room full of people who decided he didn't belong before he played a single note. And the moment he opens his mouth, Gregory Tate laughs in his face, while Eleanor Sterling lectures him on the requirements. If you were standing in that doorway watching, what would you have wanted to do? Tell me honestly in the comments. He didn't walk out. What stopped him was not courage, exactly. It was Della's hands on his face an hour earlier, and the sign Walter had taped to the Baldwin. Student in progress. And the simple, stubborn fact that he had not come all this way to give these people the ending they were already writing. Eli sat down on the bench. He adjusted it. He looked at the keys of a piano finer than anything he had ever touched, a piano without a single sticking note, and he understood for the first time, with a strange calm spreading through his chest, that for the next few minutes none of the people at that table could take this instrument away from him. The hall waited. Tate checked his watch. Eleanor Sterling had her pen poised over the score sheet, the box for a repertoire already, in her mind, a question mark she would mark down against him. And Eli, before he played, did something none of them expected. He turned slightly on the bench toward the panel, and in a clear, quiet voice that did not shake, he said, "It's called Morning on Wexley Street. I wrote it for my teacher, Mr. Walter Briggs. He taught me for free for 4 years on a broken piano. He passed away in January. He never got to hear it finished, so I'm going to finish it for him now." Then he turned back to the keys, lifted his hands, and brought his right index finger down on a single high note, clean, soft, and steady, and let it ring out into the silence. Right here is the moment everything turns. Eli is about to play a piece nobody in that room asked for, nobody expected, and nobody thought a boy like him had any business writing. Before I tell you what happened when his hands really started to move, what would your next move have been in his shoes? Walk out or play? Tell me in the comments before you hear how it went. The single note hung in the air, and then it was joined by another, lower, and another. And the melody began to gather itself the way light gathers at the start of a day. It started simply, a few notes in the right hand circling, hunting, the way a 7-year-old hunts a hymn one finger at a time on a broken Baldwin. Anyone listening for the first 3 seconds might have thought it was a beginner's tune, almost a nursery thing, and Gregory Tate's expression had already begun to settle into vindicated boredom. Then the left hand came in underneath, And the simple thing was suddenly not simple at all, because beneath that wandering, childlike melody, Eli laid down a current of low chords that turned the whole picture in an instant from morning light into something with grief running through it, the melody up top still innocent, still circling, while everything below it ached. That was the second 4 seconds. And somewhere in there, Gregory Tate stopped checking his watch. It built. Eli's small body moved with the music now, the way Walter had taught him, the whole self into the keys and not just the fingers. The melody he had found in the dark on the night of the funeral climbed and fell and circled, back, and at the top of its climb it broke on purpose into a dissonance that resolved a half-second later into the warmest chord the room had heard all morning, and the effect of it, that small heartbreak followed instantly by that small mercy, was so exact, so deliberate, so far beyond anything an 11-year-old who taught himself off the radio had any right to do, that Marcus Reyes leaned forward and put his hand over his mouth in the precise gesture Walter Briggs had made the first time he ever heard the boy play. 10 seconds. That was all it took. 10 seconds in, and the laughter was not just gone. It had been replaced by something that felt almost like shame. Eli played on. He had no sheet music for this. The taped pages on the desk were the classical pieces he'd brought just in case, and he never looked at them once. The whole composition lived in his hands. He played the part he had written for the way the kettle pitched up before the boil. He played the thumping of the dryer and the engine of the 14 bus slowing at the corner. He played his grandmother's laugh, and his mother coming home gray with exhaustion at 7 in the morning, and he played the broken middle C of the old Baldwin, working it deliberately into the piece, that stubborn sticking note, so that even on a flawless Steinway you could somehow hear the ghost of the ruined piano he had learned on. He played 4 years of a man who didn't have to caring. He played a thank you he had never gotten to say. In the third row, Eleanor Sterling had set down her pen. She would tell people, later, that she could not have predicted what happened to her in that hall. She had heard 10,000 auditions. She had built, over 18 years, a wall so thick that she had forgotten it was a wall at all, and had begun to mistake it for clear sight. And this child, this small boy in a too big shirt and another child's shoes, whom she had been ready to dismiss in under a minute, was taking that wall apart note by note without even knowing she was behind it. She thought of Howard. She thought of her late husband saying, the year before he died, that talent is everywhere, and opportunity is not, and how she had nodded, and then spent 18 years quietly disagreeing with him in the privacy of this very table. She thought of the girl she had been at 20, who could have done something like this once, before she set it down for good. And Eleanor Sterling, who had not cried in longer than she could remember, felt her vision blur and did not reach up to stop it. The piece moved toward its end. Eli brought the melody back to where it began, the simple, childlike circling, the morning light. But it was different now, because everyone in the room had been all the way down into the grief, beneath it and back, and so the innocence at the end was not the same innocence as the beginning. It was innocence that had been somewhere. He let the final phrase rise one last time, hesitated on that deliberate broken note, and resolved it, very softly, into a single low chord that he held with the pedal down, until it faded entirely into the air of the hall, and there was nothing left but silence. For a moment no one moved. Eli sat with his hands in his lap, looking at the keys, suddenly 11 years old again, and not sure what he was supposed to do. He had finished it. For Mr. Briggs, he had done the thing he came to do. Then a sound came from the third row. It was Marcus Reyes on his feet, applauding, and his face was wet, and he wasn't trying to hide it. Gregory Tate stood next, the man who had laughed twice, and Tate, who had spent a career being impressed by no one, was applauding with the helpless, unguarded expression of a person who has just been reminded why he gave his whole life to music in the first place. And then Eleanor Sterling stood, slowly, gripping the table, the tears running freely down a face that the staff at the back of the hall had never once seen anything but composed, and she did not say a word, because there were no words yet, only the standing and the weeping and the sound of 3 pairs of hands in an enormous empty room, trying to be louder than they were. Behind the doors at the back, Della Carter, who had heard the silence and then the applause and could not stand the not knowing, had pushed the door open just wide enough to see. She saw the judges on their feet. She saw the great room standing for her grandson, and Della, who had stretched a chicken across 4 dinners and held a child's face in her hands every morning of his life, and buried more than one person she loved without ever once letting Eli see her break, leaned against that doorframe and pressed her church coat to her mouth and wept the way you weep when something you prayed for in private, never quite believing, arrives in front of you in broad daylight. It was Eleanor Sterling who finally crossed the hall, walked up the side steps onto the stage, and stood in front of the bench where the boy sat. She looked down at him for a long moment. "Young man," she said, and her voice was not steady at all now, "do you know what you've just done?" Eli shook his head. "You've made an old woman remember something she spent 18 years forgetting," she said. "Your teacher, she had to stop and gather herself. Mr. Briggs, he taught you well, but he didn't teach you that. What you just did, nobody teaches that. He only made sure nobody crushed it." She used almost the exact words Walter had used to Della at the bus stop, though she could not have known it, and Eli's eyes filled because he heard the echo. "What was your teacher's name again?" "Walter Briggs," Eli said. Eleanor Sterling nodded slowly, and something seemed to settle and harden into purpose behind her wet eyes. "Walter Briggs," she repeated, as if filing it somewhere permanent. Eli Carter walked into that hall as a poor boy with a taped-up bag of sheet music, and he walked out having made the entire panel rise to their feet in tears. But here's what I keep thinking about. Somewhere out there watching this is someone who once stood their ground when a whole room had already counted them out. And the truth came out, anyway. If that's you, I want to hear it. Share your moment in the comments. Somebody scrolling tonight needs to read it. Eli won the Sterling Scholarship. That part you have probably already guessed. The panel did not need to deliberate. Gregory Tate said afterward that there was nothing to deliberate about, that you don't measure something like that against a Mozart sonata played correctly by a child with a $40 an hour tutor. The full ride was his. Tuition, instrument, instruction, every door that had been locked, now open. But Eleanor Sterling was not finished, and what she did next is the part of this story worth carrying with you. In the weeks after the audition, she went back through 18 years of records, 18 years of scholarship winners, and she counted, honestly, for the first time how many of them had come from families like Eli's. Families without private teachers, without good instruments at home, without the kind of preparation the panel had quietly come to require. The number was small, painfully small. Howard had endowed the award to find talent anywhere, and Eleanor understood now that the machinery she herself had run had been filtering it down to the children who least needed the help every single year, while she sat at that table believing she was simply recognizing excellence. So she changed it. Using a portion of the Sterling Endowment and a good deal of her own money, she established a second program alongside the scholarship. A free preparatory division at the Brennan Conservatory, open by audition to any child in the greater Marlow area, with instruments provided, instruction provided, and transportation provided, so that no 11-year-old would ever again have to take 2 buses across the city in another boy's shoes to be laughed at by people who should have known better. She insisted that the audition rules be rewritten to allow original compositions, equal in standing to the standard repertoire, because, as she put it to the board, we very nearly turned away the most gifted child I have heard in this hall in 30 years because his truest work did not fit our form. We will not make that mistake twice. She named the program the Briggs Initiative, after a retired schoolteacher who had taught one boy for free on a broken piano and changed the course of a conservatory he never lived to see. Gregory Tate, the man who laughed, asked to teach in it. He teaches there still. He tells his new students about a Saturday in March when an 11-year-old reminded him that the most dangerous thing a musician can do is decide in advance what he is about to hear. The first time Eli played the finished morning on Wexley Street in public at a small recital at the conservatory that spring, Della and Renata sat in the front row. Renata had switched a shift to be there. She sat in the dim hall in the clothes she wore to her mother's church, and when her son walked out onto the stage in a jacket that finally fit, she did not cry, because Della had told her she had to make it through at least the first piece. And they had practiced. They made it through about 4 bars. Now that everything came full circle for Eli, the talent recognized, the doors thrown open, a whole program built so the next kid wouldn't have to fight that hard. I keep coming back to one question for you. Have you ever been in a room where people decided who you were before you got to show them? And then you showed them anyway? Tell me about it down below. There's real power in those stories, and somebody needs yours. Eli Carter is 14 now. He is in his 3rd year at the Brennan Conservatory's preparatory division. Where he is, his teachers will tell you with a kind of careful awe, not the most disciplined student they have ever had, and very possibly the most gifted. He still composes more than he practices his scales, and Marcus Reyes, who became his primary instructor, and who has never forgotten the morning he stood up weeping in an empty hall, is still working on that balance with him, gently, the way Walter would have. Eli is taller now. The serious eyes are the same. He still goes quiet for long stretches, still hearing things the rest of us walk right past. He still lives on Wexley Street. Della would not hear of moving, and Eli would not hear of leaving Della. Renata cut back to day shifts last year. The scholarship covered the things that used to eat her overnight pay, and she sleeps now when ordinary people sleep, and she has started, after all these years, to look rested. On Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, Eli volunteers at the New Hope Community Center in the back room that used to be a Sunday school class, where the old brown Baldwin still sits with its cracked soundboard and its stubborn middle C. He teaches the younger kids there, for free. There is a hand-lettered sign taped to the top of that piano, in a 14-year-old's handwriting now, that reads exactly what the old one read: "Do not remove. Student in progress." Last winter, on the anniversary of Walter Briggs's death, the Briggs Initiative held its first showcase, and 22 children, who would never otherwise have set foot in a conservatory, walked across the stage of Hartwell Hall and played. Eleanor Sterling sat in the 3rd row for all of it, in the seat where she used to sit in judgment, and this time she was not deciding anything. She was just listening. Eli closed the showcase. He played Morning on Wexley Street, the way he always does on that day, for the man who taught him that the thing he heard in the world was worth something. And when he finished, the whole hall stood, not in surprise this time, the way they had 3 years before, but in the full and grateful knowledge of exactly who they were standing for. 10 seconds. That is all it took, that first morning, for a room full of people to find out that they had been completely wrong about a boy. It is worth remembering how fast it can happen, how the very people who laughed can be standing in tears before the next breath if only the one they counted out refuses to leave the room. Eli Carter did not have money, or the right clothes, or a famous teacher, or a single voice in that hall on his side. What he had was a true thing, and the nerve to play it for someone who could no longer hear it. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything. If this story moved you, or if it brought to mind a moment of your own, a time you were underestimated, or a teacher who saw something in you that no one else did, or somebody you refused to give up on, I hope you'll share it in the comments. Every voice deserves to be heard. And every now and then, all it takes is 10 seconds for the whole room to finally hear it.